Hi, y'all. I am back with chapter 16. Whose country? Old comers and newcomers. And we've got a Roman immigrant family there on the yellow square at their arrival at Ellis Island around 1900. Ellis Island was the port of entry for tens of millions of immigrants to the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and I'm going to include a video on that. The island is next door to the Statue of Liberty. Emma Lazarus wrote The New Colossus, a famous poem about the Statue of Liberty. The poem is engraved on the base of the statue, and its most famous lines read, "From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Keep ancient lands, you storied pomp," cries she with silent lips. "Give me your tired," this is the phrase you may have heard before, "give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Whose country? Old comers and newcomers. And we are right here again. Chapter 16. American cities and factories bulged with people. Some had come from the quiet American countryside. Others had been peasants in Europe and came across the ocean with high hopes. All of them had been told that everyone would succeed in America. All you had to do was be honest and work hard. But many honest, hard-working immigrants found they could not get ahead. And these disappointed Americans were not willing to take their disappointments lying down. The United States was the land of help yourself. It is not surprising then that the post-Civil War years, after the Civil War, because we finished studying that, became a time of conflict. Working men began organizing in labor unions. Their aim was a better life, shorter hours, higher wages. But peaceful means did not always seem strong enough. Beginning in the 1870s, labor battles became more common. In 1872, nearly 100,000 builders and mechanics went on strike in New York City. They refused to work longer than 8 hours in one day. After several months, they won their point. So what would happen is workers would organize a group and they would all say, "We aren't working unless you do this thing." And the business owners might not have a choice but to listen to them, because if they all are agreeing, they have no workers. So that's why a union would help, because without a union, if only 10 people did it, then they would just get rid of those 10 people. You needed everyone to fight for the rights of the workers. Miners in the East Pennsylvania cornfields organized a secret society. They called themselves the Molly Maguires. In 1875, 10 of them were hanged for murder. Private detectives hired by the employers had put together the case against them. Then in 1877, workers on the Baltimore and Ohio railroads struck. Their work stoppage soon spread across the country. In West Virginia, 9 people died as a result of the strike. In Pittsburgh, 26 died. And I'm not sure why they died. But here's a picture, right, of some of the Molly Maguires executed for murder based on flimsy evidence presented by a private detective hired by the defendant's employer in order to break the union of which they were members. The employer himself had served as their court-appointed special prosecutor. 6 of the Maguires were hanged in the prison yard at Pottsville, Pennsylvania. 4 were hanged the same day about 30 miles away at the Carbon County Prison in Montchunk, which is now Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. So I'll try to see if I got some more information about that for you. So I don't think that is necessarily really explains why so many workers are dead. I'm not sure if it was violence or what happened. In 1886, the so-called Haymarket Massacre occurred in Chicago. When police tried to break up a meeting of anarchists and communists, someone exploded a bomb. 7 policemen died and 70 others were wounded. In 1892, during a fight at the steel works at Homestead, Pennsylvania, 7 men died. The Pullman strike of 1894 again tied up the railroads, and the strike became a minor civil war when federal troops began fighting against workers. A conservative and law-abiding organization of trade unions, the American Federation of Labor, became strong among skilled workers. The Federation's aim was simply better wages and shorter hours. Meanwhile, a small number of radicals called Wobblies, who aimed to take the factories away from their owners, started the International Workers of the World. So let's look at that picture up there. It says laborers were outraged by the conviction that they were being mistreated by their employers. After all, the business owners were living in luxury. Meanwhile, the workers could barely earn enough to buy food for their families. But the employers were equally outraged that anyone thought they should have to pay their workers any more than the market would bear. After all, if one man was dissatisfied with his wages, 5 or 10 would willingly take his place. The anger on all sides led to violent confrontations. Here, a hand-colored contemporary print from the period shows the Chicago train yard during the Pullman Railroad strike of 1894. Striking workers burned some 600 freight cars in this particular confrontation. All over the country, crime showed an alarming increase. In 1890, the prisons held 50% more criminals than 10 years before, and the murder rate in the United States, already twice the rate in England or in Germany, went up every year. National crime rings used hideouts in Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, and scores of other cities to help their members escape the police. The city crowds at the Philadelphia Centennial Expedition of 1876, remember we heard about that, right? At the Chicago Columbian Exposition of 1893, and every day on the streetcars or in department stores, were a pickpocketer's paradise. Young hoodlums terrorized San Francisco with knives and six-shooters. I'm not sure what a six-shooter is. I'll try to look that up for you. Not sure exactly what a six-shooter is. A type of gun, I think, but I don't know. I'm going to look it up. People invented new expressions to describe these new criminals. They were badger game experts and knockout drop artists. Green goods men tricked innocent farmers into exchanging their real money for large bundles of counterfeit. In 1880, one go-getting criminal from Springfield, Illinois, went to New York where he made a fortune selling gold bricks. Before a fellow thief killed him, he took in over $250,000 by selling to gullible country boys lead bricks that he had painted gold. A ring working out of New York managed one of the biggest bank robbers in history. In 1878, from a single job they had planned for 3 years, they got $3 million. Stores, and I can't even imagine what that would be worth today. 30 million? I don't know what that would be worth. I'll try to find that out for you too. Stores with fancy goods on display naturally attracted shoplifters. Meanwhile, newspapers, anxious to sell more copies so they could attract more advertising, became more sensational than ever. They found that it paid to feature the worst crimes and to glamorize the worst criminals. So the newspaper was trying to put the really bad stuff up, okay? In business and in government, too, there were notorious scandals. Beginning soon after the Civil War, President Grant made a bad start. He was so honest himself that he did not know a crook when he saw one. Some found their way into his cabinet and then used their position in the government to make a fortune for their railroads or their banks. All decent Americans had reason to be worried. Was this the best they could expect from the Jefferson that they had so hopefully called an empire for liberty? There's a sensational magazine where they would have a painting there of a story. They would play it up and make it more extravagant to sell more papers. Poor newcomers, and this is the picture here, poor newcomers arrive in America while rich oldcomers leave their governess for a vacation in Europe. A magazine illustration here by Charles S. Reinhardt. So you've got poor newcomers arriving in America and rich oldcomers are leaving to go to Europe on vacation. The early American frontier had been a line on the outer edge of settlements. Beyond was the no man's land where Indians had not yet given up and where settlers had not yet conquered. Out there, a man could make a fresh start. In the centennial year of 1876, the defeat of Chief Sitting Bull and Chief Crazy Horse and their braves marked the last great battle between the Indians and the invading settlers. 15 years later, the superintendent of the census reported that there was no more wilderness frontier. By the end of the 1800s, then, the New World had lost much of its newness. One bright young historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, proposed the theory that the end of the frontier explained many of the country's troubles. According to Turner, what had made America the land of the promise was not its cities, but its frontier. The free land out west, he explained, had also been a safety valve. In earlier times, if a man in an eastern city wanted a second chance, he could move to the west. But now that the country was filling up, it was no longer possible to find your second chance by going out to the edge of civilization. If you were unlucky enough to be a newcomer in a slum, there seemed to be no escape. Was it surprising then that so many Americans were unhappy and that so many felt that they had to fight for a better life? For a while, it seemed that the country might be divided between oldcomers and newcomers. Oldcomers themselves, of course, came from immigrant families originally, but their families had been in America for a long time. Among them were the rich and famous. Few were crowded into slums. The oldcomers were in charge in the older eastern states. Those states still controlled Congress. Most of the people with money, education, and power were oldcomers, but the oldcomers did not agree on how to cure the country's ills. Some were simply frightened. They wanted to keep the country the way it was. They blamed all the troubles on the newcomers. Their answer was to slam the door on most people. Simply because their families had been here longer, they thought the whole nation belonged to them. At Harvard College, a group of New England blue bloods. Blue bloods are rich people, right? So people that have blue blood running through their veins, they would probably be the old comers then. Let's see if they tell us more about them. They thought the world was coming to an end. Some of the professors taught that there was an Anglo-Saxon race superior to all others. This race, they said, was separated from others not by color, but by what countries the people had come from. The superior people came from England and Germany, which is not true, of course. 3 young men in the graduating class of 1889, Charles Warren, Robert de Dorsey Ward, and Prescott Farnsworth Hall, took these lessons to heart. They had been raised near Boston, but they realized that their families came from England and Germany. Their parents were horrified by the hordes of vulgar immigrants, and especially by those with unfamiliar ways, from Ireland and from Southern and Eastern Europe. The solution to the nation's problems, they said, was to keep out all people who were not like themselves. 5 years after graduating from college then, Warren, Ward, and Hall formed the Immigration Restriction League. They determined to persuade Congress to pass laws that would keep all undesirable immigrants, or the newcomers, They wanted to create a law that would keep out newcomers, so no more newcomers can come. These new immigrants, they argued, were the main cause of the increasing crime, the strikes, and most of the trouble of the country. To keep out the undesirables, they proposed a literacy test. According to the proposed law, if you were more than 14 years old and you wanted to come into the United States, you would have to prove you could read and write. You did not have to know English, but you had to be able to read and write the language of the country from which you came. At first sight, the test seemed harmless enough, but it was aimed against the newcomers from certain countries. For example, poor peasants from Italy and Greece had no chance to go to school. The Boston Blue Bloods believed that because newcomers from such countries were not Anglo-Saxons, they must be inferior. But they did not dare list the particular countries in their proposed law. So so what that means is that some of the Blue Bloods thought that there were people that were superior to them, but they didn't actually list those people's names. They just created these rules that were going to make it harder from people from poor countries that maybe hadn't been in school to come. And people that had been in school a while and could read and write, it would be easier for them to come. All right, so back on the top of page 109, many people already in the United States came from these countries. They would be insulted, and they too elected members of Congress. Year after year, the Immigration Restriction League tried to persuade Congress to pass a literacy test. But even when they finally pushed their bill through Congress, they did not manage to make it into a law. One president after another vetoed the bill. Okay, so remember, we haven't talked about this a lot yet in class, but the bill has to go through Congress. But then even after it does, the president can just say, I don't like it, and can veto it. Okay, so the presidents kept vetoing the law. President Grover Cleveland called the law underhanded because it did not say what it really meant. President William Howard Taft said the United States needed the labor of all immigrants and should teach them to read. President Woodrow Wilson agreed. All 3 presidents said the law was un-American. The United States had always been a nation of nations. It made no sense to keep people out because they were oppressed. America had always been a haven for the oppressed. It was in America that the starving could find bread and the illiterate could learn to read. In 1917, however, the war in Europe frightened Americans. They were so afraid that even though President Wilson vetoed the bill twice, 1917 would have been World War I, which we really haven't started talking about yet. Even though President Wilson vetoed the bill twice, it had enough votes in Congress to pass even over his veto. So you can have enough votes that the veto doesn't work. It's basically what it is. And we're going to go into this a lot more and you'll go into this a lot more in your upcoming school years as well. Out on the West Coast, old comers feared newcomers from Asia. They worried about hordes that might come across the Pacific, hordes of people. And they had persuaded Congress to pass a Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Then, in 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt persuaded the Japanese government to stop their people from emigrating or coming into the United States, leaving their country and coming in. So you've got emigrating and then you've got immigrating, okay? For some odd reason, they called it a gentleman's agreement. This became the slang expression for any agreement to discriminate against people because of their race when you were ashamed to admit what you were really doing. Since there were so few Chinese American and Japanese American voters among the newcomers, the fearful few among the oldcomers found it easier to have their way. Okay, and that's the end of chapter 16. And I'm not going to go through the questions there, but you should put on your timeline, Zoe, 1886, the Haymarket Massacre. Okay, and I will have some videos that go up with this.